Good morning. It is February 16th, 2019, and this is the latest episode of Cryptosophy. Today we have the special privilege of being joined by Martin Harrison McNulty, a student of applied economics at the University of Cincinnati and dutiful employee of Kroger, and a specific subset of Kroger. What is it? The data?
I work on the e-commerce team.
E-commerce team. So today, as the title insinuates, we're going to be discussing the spiritual fate of the West and whether and to what extent Christianity might provide a remedy of sorts. Our starting off point is really going to be an analysis / summary discussion of how the state, the church, and the academy today are in a rather sorry state, a crisis of identity, so to speak. And from there, we will kind of peruse through an intellectual heritage that starts with Nietzsche, stems through Heidegger, and goes all the way up to Jordan Peterson. But before we kind of get into to all these discussions, Harrison, I'd like to just get a little bit of background on you. Obviously, I know you. You're a close friend of mine. But if you could just spend 60, 90 seconds giving your background, your education, etc. Harrison, I think you're muted.
Hey, Doyle. Sorry. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Good. I don't identify as any sort of expert. I much more identify as an enthusiast or an enthusiastic enthusiast in all domains of knowledge. I went to Xavier with you for 4 years. I was 1 year behind you. Graduated actually with 3 degrees, one in political philosophy and economics and history. I then enrolled in UC, where I'm now a grad student in economics. Part-time now, I'm working as a data analyst for Kroger. I really just can't wait to speak with you about all these incredibly interesting but also really pressing issues.
Yes, no, it'll certainly be exciting. Can you give a little bit of maybe background, at least on your high-level philosophical attitudes, religious affiliation, etc.?
Yeah, sure. I'm a Roman Catholic. It does mean a lot to me. I consider it a part of my daily and hourly life. As a scholar of philosophy, I'm unwilling to say philosopher because that would put me in the same league with all these other different people who I do study. But I am an avid reader of philosophy. That's the way I guess I would describe myself. I suppose I take a kind of generalist view of the Western canon. That would be the most important thing to me. I've been inspired by a lot of people, though I wouldn't consider myself an expert in any one of them. Certain people who I've read a lot of might be, or I'm at least very enthusiastic about, would be Nietzsche, Strauss, maybe Burke. Those 3 would probably be my main people.
Fantastic. Thanks for that background. Okay, so to the topic at hand, the spiritual fate of the West in Christianity. I've been thinking a lot about recently kind of the crisis that I think exists at the heart of the Western world today. And I think that it's easy at all times to perhaps have a sort of fatalistic or what would you call it? Just an emergency-based mindset where we're concerned that the world that we're born into is falling apart, and that presents a crisis of identity for all of us. But I think there's something very tangible going on in the major institutions of the Western world. And to paint with a broad brush, I think that those can generally be depicted as the state, the church, and the academy. It kind of goes without saying that the crisis of the academy has, it's been discussed quite a bit, especially by the intellectual dark web figures like Jonathan Haidt, Jordan Peterson, and even just the disgusting, to say the least, things that we witness on protests on college campuses, simply to people that either speak from a centrist or slightly right of center point of view, and that they get casted as alt-right Nazis, and therefore any sort of violent protest becomes appropriate to rid a campus of the germ or the plague that those thinkers represent. But also, I think the destruction of the church and the state is pretty self-evident today, right now, too. I mean, especially with the scandals that have rocked the Catholic Church in just this calendar year. The rampant abuse, not only of minors but also of young men studying information to the priesthood by other priests, and in the most egregious case by Cardinal McCarrick, who, as you let me know right before this call, has since been defrocked. But I think it's evidence of a far more systemic issue that exists within the hierarchy of the church. And then the final piece is the state, and I think this can provide a great starting off point, and I'd love to get your feedback. Yesterday, Donald Trump declared a state of emergency with regards to immigration so as to build his wall by fiat without the approval of Congress, and reappropriating funds from the military, from the DEA, and some other agencies.
Yeah. That is all of that is extremely interesting. I do think, though, that I'd like to draw a distinction first, in that we might phrase it as partially a suicide and partially a murder. You just started off by listing these kind of intellectual dark web figures who are continually deplatformed when they try to speak. That definitely is a problem, especially because, certainly people like Haidt and Peterson are entirely respectable academics, who are, if not just a tad heterodox, in regards to the current culture. So they're being deplatformed because a relatively small but extremely politically effective group of people are pushing for these deplatformings and these kind of slightly Orwellian actions at institutional level. But I don't think that small group of people that are getting these things done are necessarily reflective of some kind of larger, kind of a really structurally, say, threatening movement within the Western world today. I would say that when we look at these institutions that are crumbling, it's less a murder and more a suicide, and that they have fundamentally lost themselves, who they are, why they exist. And I think that, as you already pointed out, is particularly evident in the various scandals, especially the child abuse scandals roiling the Catholic Church. And that I think a lot of priests, so there is a segment of priests that are rapists, and they are terrible human beings. I don't know what's waiting for them after they die. However, the real problem is that a much larger swath of the clergy has kind of decided they're not going to take it seriously and just let it sit and fester for decade on decade. And that's how we get to the place where we're at today. And I think that's more, it's not a result of some kind of liberal or, say, quasi-Marxist conspiracy, as we see with the platformings. It's more a result of them really not caring about the vocation in life that they chose to accept.
Would you say that there's an analog to what's happened with the silence among a vast majority of clerics? Do you think that that's analogous to the same kind of silence that's going on in the academy, where perhaps it's only a very politically effective and vocal subset of professors and teachers, but because of some kind of social pressure that exists on campuses, this silent majority has stopped simply being silent and stopped acting as well?
Yeah, that's a good point. So what I think has happened, and this is something I'm pulling straight from Jonathan Haidt, is that the universities have, I want to be careful with my wording, they've begun to understand that, not understand, that's the wrong word, they've become convinced that the proper role for just a person in human society today is to care most of all, and first and foremost about the victim rather than about the truth. And if you were to ask them about the truth, they would still say that they care about it to an extreme extent, as they ought to. But really, their mission in life has no longer been to serve and protect truth, but to, say, further the cause of the victim. And I think that's a result of really overlearning the lessons of the 20th century. Not that the lessons of the 20th century shouldn't be learned. I'm saying they've been overlearned. And so, for instance, one example of that might appeal to a liberal state of mind would be the Iraq War. Because after World War II, we essentially knocked down a series of tyrannies in Europe and in East Asia and set up democracies. And in Japan and Germany, those democracies worked perfectly. It was actually kind of incredible how we were able to just knock down these tyrants and then set up flourishing democracies. And that seemed to be a lesson worth learning. However, I would say the lesson was overlearned, and for the last, say, 25 years in the Middle East, we've become very, very enthusiastic about knocking down tyrannies and trying to set up democracies. However, the conditions necessary to create a flourishing democracy are not always there. And so my point in saying all this is not to diverge or to kind of shift the conversation to foreign policy. My point is that even if you're a liberal person listening, there is a very, very real phenomenon of overlearning the lessons of the horrors of the 20th century that has bad effects. And I think one additional an additional instance of the overlearning of the lessons of the 20th century is in academia, when the entire really mission of what it means to be an academic in the last 30 years has shifted from preserving and serving truth to furthering the cause of the victim. And that is how you get these kinds of new, what should I call them, academic dispositions of that's why Marxism has picked up so much and found a second life in the last 20 years on college campuses. The same thing with, I would call it the kind of very, very unreasonably enthusiastic, kind of far left, racial ideologies, things that are meant to, what's the word I'm looking for? Make up for past racial abuses that end up being very tyrannical in themselves.
Got it. So you made a really interesting distinction here regarding kind of victim and perpetrator, because it seems that while it seems that both the church and the academy are crumbling at the face of this distinction, but the academy has chosen to side with the victim in all cases, even if that victim is not a true victim. And on the contrary, it seems that the church has decided, or perhaps more appropriately, the certain groups of clerics have chosen to side with the perpetrator at the expense of the victim, because there are such things as cases of false abuse. So I guess my question here is, because those appear to be mirrored phenomenon, right? The reverses of each other. Is it proper to say that they could possibly stem from the same cause, or is it simply the case that they happen to be falling prey to opposite sides of a dichotomy at the same time?
I just think there's two different social genealogies at work. So you might view kind of, if we were to look at the history of the Catholic Church in like America, so I don't mean outside of the United States, I mean within the United States, it was kind of just this kind of, what am I trying to say? It became domesticated. It became, becoming a priest would be a very easy way to gain some level of social distinction and some kind of respect and a small amount of ethos in your community that really didn't have to be earned. And that kind of gave way to a sort of kind of just general a malaise of spirit, if you will, in which case, being a priest is no longer a radical, or in the 20th century, so, up until 1990, being a priest was not some kind of radical thing to do with your life, as it might have been for the early Christians. And that is what resulted in this extremely unspirited clergy that can then do things like turn the other eye away from sexual abuse, because it doesn't need to be dealt with in order for them to keep their social status. And also, they never really cared about true radical Christianity in the first place. Whereas, so that social kind of genealogy is very different from the one that is on college campuses. And even before the deplatforming and the far left of like the past few years, if you go back to the years, say 1990 or 80, there was still the spirit of the far left academic 60s very alive on college campuses. And I think they're now in sort of what they would call a renaissance of regenerating that kind of I don't know, spiritual academic era. I'm being too loose with that word spiritual. I mean, it was a kind of a center of being and a way of life for them. And I think they're kind of happy they've rediscovered that. And so I'm not sure what to make of, you're right, what to make of the similarity there between victim and perpetrator, which are on different sides of the coin for both of them. I would just point to the fact that these are two entirely, not only different kind of lines of thought, but also just they have different memories of who they are, because these are two very different institutions, the academy and the church. That would be my response.
That's interesting. So, as a little bit of a personal anecdote, I always remember that when I was young, my grandfather held preachers, doctors, lawyers, and professors as part of this esteemed class of professions where you're, in some sense, a servant of men beyond all others. And I wonder
these
to what
people
extent
hold the world together. Yeah.
To what extent does the fact that someone who is truly a son of and lived the majority of his life in the 20th century and views the priesthood and the professoriate on the same rung or status within society, whether and to what extent that could be responsible for the same kind of egregious activities, both on the sides of the perpetrators and on the sides of the victims.
Yeah. Was that a question? Could you rephrase that?
More of a comment or a notice.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that do you think it's possible that because those two like states of being or livelihoods within society are on that level, it gives them a certain level of non-practicality with regards to the victim-perpetrator distinction, whereas a normal person is going to side with the person who is wronged when they know, in fact, that person has been wronged. But because of this higher echelon in society that they live in, they're able to kind of abstract from the practical truth of what actually happened and side univocally either on the side of the perpetrator in the clerical sense or in the side of the victim in the professorial sense.
Yeah. And as you're speaking, one thing that occurred to me is that the academics, the professoriate, do seem to be becoming a little more priestly just in the way they approach their lives, whereas the clergy really seems to be becoming a little more businesslike in just the way they approach their profession. And so it honestly does seem that like the academy, or the professoriate more specifically, is still in its kind of first phase of being, the way that the early Christians were in the first century CE. Marxism is a 20th century invention, or at least certainly the first time it was ever applied in any sort of real way, which means the professoriate right now is still in kind of the earliest dawnings of this kind of global political dispensation of this kind of far left victim serving. I mean that in the best way, but it is a victim serving kind of way of life. Whereas this is just one thing that occurred to me while you were talking. The clergy as it stands now is this 2,000-year-old, not quite a fossil, but it needs to reclaim itself if it wants to survive. There seems to be a radical age difference there.
So what is the? So I think we've tapped an interesting line or a dichotomy that shows that the crumbling of the academy and the church are at least in some way related, even if it's diametrically. What of this of these symptoms do you see in the state? I mean, I think clearly in the body politic, at least in the United States, there's a polarity that perhaps has not been seen since the Civil War, and I think to a certain extent you could even say that it's a harsher polarity that even existed then. What if anything does that have to do with what's happening in the academy and the church today?
That's a good question. That's a really broad question. I'm not sure I have a clean answer to it. I kind of alluded before that I kind of, to some extent, I'd like to just pull away from the idea that each of these crumblings are kind of a different manifestation of the same dialectic. And I kind of gestured to that before with the academy and the church having different memories and different histories. And for that reason, what they're going through simultaneously, it's difficult to just theoretically connect it all. And similarly with the state, I think that's true. The state's going through this. It really does seem like the climax of the culture wars, going all the way back to the founding of America, or at least since the Civil War. We've kind of lost the ability to reconcile with ourselves. I think a really, really, maybe the biggest constitutional problem right now in America is different groups across the country hating mental phantoms of different groups, even if those groups that they hate are not significant or even present to the extent they think they are. And so it's kind of a I referred to more earlier. I referred to, is it a murder or is it a suicide? It seems to be a sort of murder suicide in which groups corrupt themselves in trying to fight evils that are not present to the extent that they believe they are. Yeah, the United States as a polity, again, has a different memory than the Church or the Academy because it has a different history as one unit than either of the two of those smaller ones, or in compared to the two of the smaller ones.
Do you see a kind of logical consequence in the presidency of Trump that gets stemmed earlier in the Republican movement, perhaps? I mean, I think it seems to me, at least, that the Republican Party that elected, or even just the American people that elected George W. Bush, is not the same America that elected Donald Trump. And I'm curious whether this is kind of a new emergence, or have they been there all along but kind of hiding in the shadows?
I think it's definitely a new emergence, or at least a slow transformation. It seems like the Republic right now is living off of cultural resources that it can't regenerate. And to the extent that those resources are sapped, it is just degrading itself. I've been working on this idea recently that if we understand politics to be the most important thing that the human animal does, then politics will degrade. But if we understand just our daily lives as people in communities, in relation to the divine and in relation to our past, if we just consider, if we consider ourselves, I don't mean to tap the classical liberal thing, but if we consider ourselves as individuals, not a part of a collective, or at least not as a kind of mass movement, then we may have a healthy polity. But if we continually understand the most salient possible respect of our lives to be the extent to which we participate in mass movements, then those mass movements will degrade. That seems to have been the kind of, to the extent that the 20th century was good, that seems to have been the good nature about it. And I know there's a lot of Make America Great Again stuff, and the retort to that is that there were definitely certain aspects of 20th century America that were not great at all. They were very, very evil, and I entirely I accept that counterpoint. But I think there was some cultural legitimacy and validity to 20th century America that is worth trying to regain, and to the extent that it existed, I think that is why.
You said something really interesting about kind of what leg does America have to stand on, and it seems that we're kind of running on cultural fumes. That is a symptom that Nietzsche also diagnosed kind of in Europe before the turn of the 20th century, right? He ultimately says that the death of God is not something that we celebrate, but rather our culture, all of the West in his case, is living on the cultural fumes that Christianity imbued it with. And now that we live in a society in which God is dead, the entire thing is going to fall to pieces. And I think that we saw what he saw and predicted was that we were going to kind of swing like a pendulum between tyranny and nihilism, right? And I think it's interesting that he chose those two terms because both Marxism and fascism embodied at their heart
both tyranny and nihilism.
Yeah, they were both tyrannies and nihilisms. And so in the face of a nothingness, the Marxist or the Soviet state and its subsidiaries kind of posited the worker as this new unit of being upon which we could build a society. And in fascist Germany, they kind of asserted the German people as this new ontological sphere that we could build a state around.
Yeah, the most ontologically salient part of the person. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I wonder, obviously the symptoms of the death of God in Europe did not go anywhere well, right? I mean, ultimately we had first, the Franco-Prussian War which was really just World War I Part One before machine guns and mustard gas and all of those things. And then we actually had World War One, which I believe, if my numbers are correct, killed 1/3 of European males between the ages of 18 and 35, which is to say that it absolutely decimated the future of Europe, so to speak. And I mean, so that didn't go well. But then ultimately, the fallout from World War I is that now there really is nothing to believe in, because the states of Europe that once one could call home — I am a Frenchman, my home is France; I am a German, my home is Germany — all of that seems to, because of the dramatic shifts in regime over the course of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, there is no longer that cultural ethos of a nation. And so it just paves the way for someone to cast the nation back into existence by an exertion of will, which is, I think, both what happens in Germany and what happens in Russia. So I guess my question is, if you're kind of seeing symptoms of the post-death of God world here in America, namely that we are living on, the cultural fumes of the will of the framers, their philosophical outlook towards the state, and all of these things, what is to remain of the United States? Do we face a similar fate that Europe faced in the 20th century?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, obviously. I consider Nietzsche's critique of, I think it was Christian Democratic Man, to be one of the most riveting philosophical arguments I've ever come across. So it's not as though I'm sitting here with some kind of answer. There's a columnist for the New York Times I like, Ross Douthat, and he made a point. I guess this is to your previous question about the Republican Party and Trump. He made a point that in the 20th century, a lot of people hated the religious right, with reasonable reasons to do so. However, you were also looking at demographically declining rates of religious observance. And so if you just put the numbers together, eventually the religious right has got to go. And the punchline was, and if you hated the religious right, just wait until you see the post-religious right. And that seems to be a good description of the alt-right. I'm not sure what the future of America holds, especially in relation to how it broke down in Europe. I don't think Americans are, at a fundamental level, and I'm not talking about changing cultural trends and whatnot, I think Americans are not as cynical as Europeans. Maybe it's because we just never had 2 world wars fought on our own soil. That could definitely be it. So I think we might be just as Marxist or fascist in the alt-right. Hopefully never to those extremes, which I don't think will be the case, because the economic pressures that centered on Europe in the 30s are not present today. But my point is, we might be as recklessly ideological as them in some respects, but I don't think we'll ever be as nihilistic as them. And that might lead to just a different version of the same hell, or it might be ultimately a quality that at least saves us from the same versions of hell. I'm not sure, but I do think that's one observation worth looking at.
I'm curious to get your thoughts or your projections on what the coming caucus and primary season is going to do to what could we call the average American, because I think very clearly the left is extrematizing itself. It's almost like there's a competition from the Democratic candidates to out-left each other. And I'm wondering to what extent that is going to further disenfranchise the average man, which was once, the party home of the Democrat. They were at home in the Democratic Party. I'm wondering to what extent does that party continue to break down? And it seems like it's just reflecting a similar breakdown that occurred with the Republican Party in the last election cycle.
Yeah, it would just be a return to form for the way these elections seem to happen. I'm not sure what that means for the average man. I think it's a slightly. The question could be structured a little bit better in that what does that mean for the parties in relation to the average man? It would just leave the average man really disappointed. The average person, I think, would like not something in the middle, because that would be a kind of business as usual aspect, but both parties are slowly appealing. Let's put it this way: they're slowly appealing to the fringe wing of multiple factions within each party's coalition. So the Republicans, you can imagine, I could say all 5 or 6 groups have to appeal to a certain number of factions to form a good Republican coalition. And the Democrats also have to appeal to, again, 5 or 6 groups of people in order to form a winning coalition. And it seems that, like, in each small faction within each party, it's more and more necessary to appeal to the most extreme factions within the party. And so you don't get, like, a more extreme just Republican or a more extreme Democrat. You get these Frankenstein creatures that, in the Republican Party are very extreme in the alt-right and the Christians and the libertarians and the corporatists. And then in the Democrats, you get very, very extreme ideologies about, what was I going to say? Helping out with redeeming neo-colonial disputes, helping out with almost socialist Marxist proposals. Those are probably the 2 big ones for the Democrats. But it's an interesting dynamic, how it's not, neither party is, even if they're extreme, they're not a monolithic being. They're kind of these Frankenstein creatures now.
Interesting. So what would you say, I mean, I think the office of the president is something that has clearly, perhaps, and this is definitely a question, has perhaps deviated the most from its intention when it was, penned for the first time in the Constitution by the framers. Do you think that the denigration or the evolution, in either sense of the term, of the offices that are of the heart of the American government, whether that's president or Congress or the courts, do you think as those shift, and they have shifted, I think, more quickly in recent years than perhaps ever before, with perhaps the slight exception of the Supreme Court, which asserted itself very early on into its current form. Do you think that as those things shift, the cultural fumes of, say, constitutionalism or honoring the founders and the framers, or even just the sense of patriotism, does that just continue to run out of steam as that happens?
That's a good question. One thing that I've been thinking recently is that the authors of the Constitution just completely mispredicted what the real kind of soul of this country would be. They thought that there would be these 3 branches of government, and they would all be jealous of each other's power. And so the judiciary would be jealous of the legislature's power and also of the executive's power. There would be this 3-way struggle for supremacy over each other. And if that were the case, there would be a reasonable balance just kind of in the tensions, and or I should say, the structures of government would be well suited to the tensions at play. But instead of this kind of 3-way tug of war for power, it's kind of this modal tug of war, these 3 separate bodies that each in a different mode or through a different avenue assert their power, are struggling together. What actually happened was that the most fundamentally relevant tensions in the country right now are actually between the 2 parties. And so instead of this 3-way tug of war between institutional branches, the real power struggle is between these 2 parties that vie back and forth, each trying to undo the other's actions and present its actions as more permanent and relevant. And they kind of go back and forth battling for the soul of the American Republic. And for that reason, we often find unities between the 3 branches that the founders did not intend. The Kavanaugh hearings were complicated, obviously, but if you go back to the Gorsuch hearings, Trump, the Senate, the Republican senators, and the soon-to-be right-wing court were all on the exact same page. There was this interesting kind of unity between branches of government because they were all controlled by Republicans. And it's only when the branches are split between parties that we get this quasi-constitutional arrangement where they're battling. But that's only because it's split along party lines. The few points in American history when all three branches were controlled by the same party, it was this entirely peaceful affair, and the branches were not jealous of each other's power. And that was because the most relevant divide is along party lines, not branch lines, in the American Republic. And this kind of harkens back to a more fundamental premise about the word constitution, in that we should take the word constitution to actually mean the structure of the polity itself in the most relevant sense. So, we could say what's the Constitution of the United States, and we could list off what it says in the U.S. Constitution itself. But if you want a much more penetrating and a much more kind of real-world answer, you would list the American Republic as it stands today in the newspapers and say that is the Constitution. That's kind of the state and structure of the American Republic, even if what's laid out in the Constitution is more official but seemingly less relevant.
See, this is really interesting because I think, and perhaps my knowledge of history is not as sharp in this particular area as it could be, but it would seem to me that the way that the government was set up in the United States was in direct opposition to what the founders saw would happen with parliamentary democracies, right? In the parliamentary democracy, you elect parliament, and then parliament forms the government and appoints all of the ministers. And it's fundamentally, because there's more than two parties, you have to make concessions, and the government that gets established with each new election cycle ultimately in some way reflects a fundamental unity at the heart of the actual parliament as a body. And it would seem to me that the framers saw that it was a possibility with a parliamentary democracy and opted to stay away from that. And yet somehow the American Republic seems to have degraded into the same sense of establishing coalitions and building a government that is all on the same page, as you say.
Yeah, we could have a long conversation about the ways that human society has always organized themselves in that kind of power structure way. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book about what power in human society is and how it always patterns out into a certain kind of way. But yeah, the American Republic does seem to be this weird kind of hybrid between the British Constitution and the ancient Roman constitutions. I'm not sure. My knowledge of history is not nearly as sharp as I would like it to be either. It seems to have worked out relatively, the fact that the Republic lasted as long as it did, being a completely fabricated instrument, is really striking. So it definitely could have been a lot worse. I'm not a person who just bashes the U.S. Constitution in any sort of way, and those people are out there. But I do think, and I guess this is to your point, it didn't have a proper appreciation for aristocrats or elites. And I know right now in American politics, elites is a very, very specific term, or a very, very kind of charged term. I'm using it the way, say, Aristotle would have used it. That's the way I intend to use it right now, in just that power brokers in the system. And so I would say right now in the American Republic, the elites are the multinational corporations, because there are bodies, they're entities that are right now powerful, seemingly without contingency, and at least in the short term, they're powerful in a way that nobody can deny them their power. And for that reason, there are the masses, all the people. That's the way the framers put it, the people. And they must be reckoned with, but also the elites, kind of this second tier, must be reckoned with by the leaders, who are the third tier. And so to have not only an effective leader, but also a leader that can be effectively just and righteous, they need to properly engage with and manage the people themselves, but also the elites, who are the real power brokers, or at least significant power brokers alongside the people. And I'm not sure the U.S. Constitution, or the authors of the Constitution, had at least a particularly well-informed understanding of that dynamic.
Interesting. So at this point in the conversation, I kind of want to incline it towards kind of some of the things we said at the outset, because I think that it's imminently relevant. I think very clearly there is perhaps not very clearly, I'm going to make the point that there is an intellectual heritage that either starts with or is crowned by Nietzsche, and then draws a line to some of Nietzsche's interesting students like Heidegger, like Jung, and then ultimately leads us to somebody in the contemporary age, Jordan Peterson, who I think really embodies well the lessons of all of those thinkers before. And it's an odd sort of heritage, because it all starts really, I think, with Nietzsche, whose sole attempt was to take a hammer to the foundations of society. Having noticed the death of God, there was an imminent necessity to rebuild the West on the basis of something new. And ultimately, he rested on the conclusion that that was going to be the creative, the creation of value for oneself, as opposed to inheriting it from a cultural ethos. And I think that that's really embedded within an understanding that Nietzsche knew all too well, and that's that everything is interpretation, and there is fundamentally an infinite set of ways that one can interpret anything. One looks at a text, for example. I mean, I recall, just in high school reading poetry, some of the interpretations of these 12-line sonnets, were just wild and out there. And you think that, wow, the world is far more complex than a 12-line sonnet or 14-line sonnet. I think they are. Their sonnets are 14 lines. But because of that complexity, the number of interpretations is no longer just infinite. It's an infinity of infinities, and the question is what to do about it. Well, Nietzsche said to create our own values, and that's kind of how we strike our way forth. Heidegger and Jung, though, have some different answers. Jung identifies that really each individual person is more of a collection of spirits, and each of those spirits interpret the world along the lines of a motivation or drive, which they were in some sense designed by evolution to fulfill. And that means that even though there's an infinite number of interpretations, there's a finite set of interpretations that actually serve the spirits that dwell within us. Heidegger, on the other hand, takes that spirit and acknowledges that, yes, there are an infinite number of interpretations, but casts the spirit of a people onto a particular leader. And the word for leader in German is Führer, which is why he was, at least until 1934, a very enthusiastic supporter of the National Socialist Party in Germany. He didn't remain so his entire life, and actually into the 40s hated the National Socialist Party and what it had become. But rather, it's interesting that faced with the infinity of interpretations, both Jung and Heidegger seek to bracket those ways which are those interpretations which are viable. And then I think Peterson takes the same kind of line of thinking, both from Jung and from Heidegger. And what he says is that, well, that Führer, that leader, is actually the individual. And it is the individual who is the compriser of all of those spirits that Jung talked about. And thus, there goes from an infinite number of possible interpretations, which is true, to only one interpretation, which is actually good for the individual. So all of that being context or background, I think this presents us with a very interesting question. Is the spiritual fate of the West going to live in the fundamental emergence of individuals, or is the spiritual fate of the West going to be a fundamental emergence of individuals that come together as a people? And whether and to what extent that's even possible in a country like America?
I don't know. Those are good questions. I'm really hesitant. The way I view this lineage is as Nietzsche being a starting point, kind of a genesis point, and then there are multiple different genealogies that branch off that. So the Heidegger line might be one, the Jung into Peterson line might be another. I'm really not sure the extent to which Peterson is influenced by Heidegger. And then, one branching off into the Straussians might be a third. So I'm not sure it's all a single lineage. I'm not sure that proposition is true. which,
but at least Nietzsche is a common ancestor.
yes, exactly. That is true. Nietzsche is the common ancestor. And I think there are important differences, say, between Peterson and Heidegger, in that Heidegger seems to have been attracted to the domain of politics, not because he cared about the good or things that are true that must be preserved. It seems to me like Heidegger was a person who was extremely attracted to, again, mass movements in politics. He was affiliated with the Nazi Party for a long time. He was a terrible human being, and so it really does make sense. He's affiliated with the Nazi Party. And then after the Third Reich collapsed, he was still alive in the 60s, and he was a really, really avid supporter of the student protests in America and of that kind of hard left turn, definitely in France and also in America, that a lot of politics took in the 60s. Heidegger wrote many, many different essays kind of asking for people to let him into that movement, which is striking because he was first a far-right guy in the 40s and then a far-left guy in the 60s. So it seems to me he wasn't a person who considers political issues. He just really, really thought that mass movements had a particular connection to being and meaning for some reason. And so I would say that was an important MO, an underrated feature of Heidegger's political being. Whereas Peterson, certainly Peterson and to a certain extent Jung, are against mass movements. They prize the individual to an extreme extent. And Peterson actually wrote his book, he said this in many interviews, 12 Rules, as a way of hopefully breaking the dialectic between, as we said at the beginning of this podcast, this kind of dialectical relationship between mass movements and then nihilism, and then finding meaning again in a mass movement and then nihilism. And he thought that maybe introducing an individualist psychology is a way of breaking that unhelpful cycle. So I would say that very much in terms of philosophy, and certainly in terms of the political implications of philosophy, Peterson and also Jung are on a very different page from Heidegger, even if they have a common ancestor in Nietzsche. And I think that's something that should be appreciated.
Interesting. No, I think your point is well taken, and I'm curious to what extent. Well, I'm curious. I mean, I think the point you bring up about Heidegger's shift from the far right to the far left. I mean, he did in fact describe himself as an epochal thinker. So I think your diagnosis of him is right. So the question then remains as pertains to the crumbling of our institutions today. I mean, I think that to a certain extent, you can draw the crumbling of the academy back to those 60s movement protests by students, both in France, which in actually almost overthrew the French government. They were so bad, and then over in the United States, that ultimately were so bad that the decades that followed them, basically, so long as you weren't protesting, you could get away with anything. So I'm curious where you think. It's clear to me where Peterson lies, at least within the crises of institutions here in the United States. He lies fundamentally on a politics of the individual, and that by growth in virtue, which is not really the word that he uses to describe it, by a growth in virtue, one can emerge and live a life that actually makes the world better, first by improving oneself. So my question is, where does Heidegger fit if you put him in 2019 in the United States? And is that something that you can draw from his philosophy, or is it just something that he would do on a whim as a way to be epochal?
Yeah, I think if you put Heidegger in 2019 in the United States, he would be thrilled by the left and the right. And I kind of, as I already alluded to, I'm really significantly out of step with Heidegger, simply because it seems like he doesn't really consider human society as a comprehensible thing with which there are goods associated. Heidegger would just be thrilled that the left and the right both have these extremely kind of, he would call them in touch with being, and what he really means is kind of very passionate and psychologically, the left is psychologically unified around its vision, and the right is psychologically unified around its vision. And the fact that they're opposed means that the divisions only become more and more cemented. And I think that's something Heidegger would have been appreciative of. I'm not sure Heidegger had a very helpful political vision at all. Though I would like to temper what I said before, in that on the individual level, Heidegger and Peterson do seem to be in step, because they both highly value reckoning with themselves. And I think that's the word you're trying to look for with virtue, and that Peterson is always pushing people to more fully understand and come to terms with who they are and what they've been through in their life. And Heidegger also has a very strong element of that on the political level and the individual level, in becoming yourself and understanding your essence as a component of and even prior to your existence.
So what do the lessons of these thinkers offer us today, if we take the collapse of American institutions as something of a fact? It would seem to me that there's a fundamental opportunity for individuals, in Peterson's sense, to emerge in Heidegger's sense, and to really be, to take a stand for one thing or another. And I'm not sure, at least in my own line of thinking, I mean, I think it's easy to paint a high-level picture of what's going to happen in America. I think that you can say that first, I mean, who knows what'll happen with the elections, but I think that the primaries and the caucuses that are coming up are fundamentally going to tear a further rift in our society. And I think that whatever happens after that, and especially if Trump happens to win re-election, the country is going to shatter itself. And the question then becomes, what does the individual do when his or her fundamental vocation is to first fix oneself, and then the community, and then the nation, right? What do we do when there's seemingly no good place to stand? Because I think that anyone who's critical would say that a fundamental dissolution of American unity on the back of political ideology and the outcome of an election simply would not be good. Harrison, I think you've muted yourself again.
Oh, damn it. Hey, I think I'll just further describe your question on its own terms, in that, so you said before the country will shatter itself. I'm not opposed to the idea that it's just already shattered, and so we might not see, disorder in the streets or the downfall of civilization or whatnot, but that this order we're living in is indeed shattered. We wake up every morning, we're not sure what's going to be on Twitter, whose life is going to be ruined, who's going to try to ruin a life and ruin their own in the process. Or we wake up every morning and we know that the people we'll interact with throughout the day might believe that political ideology is the most significant thing a person can possibly engage with, and the most significant thing they can contribute to and interact with on a daily basis. I'm not sure that's at all in any way a healthy way for a society to conduct its own business on an individual and collective level. And so imagine if so all of these features of our kind of psychological state as a society right now just don't change for decades on end, when we never get back to what all of us does recognize as normal. And it's just this state for years on end. That would be, I think, a version of hell. And I think that would be a shattered society that might have already arrived.
I think there's an interesting parallel, and this might sound off kilt at the very beginning. I think there's an interesting parallel between America and the Roman Empire. Clearly, English has emerged on the world sphere as something of a Latin, right, where it is truly the universal language. And I'm curious what an imminent collapse of American society that you would say is here already, if it does broach the gap into kind of what I would say is like a true collapse, where there is disorder in the streets and there is, rampant looting, and even the institutions of law enforcement and state and local government reach a level where they're no longer ineffective to preserve order. What happened in Rome is that there was a third institution that was able to kind of pick up the pieces and put it back together, and that namely was I guess there was two institutions. There was the hero institution, which is kind of embodied sort of like in a Charles Martel slash Charlemagne sort of figure. There's the hero institution, but then there was also the church that was there and had been around, and it had a hierarchy that had been beaten into a final shape over the course of 400 years, and that the alliance between the heroes and the church was able to preserve something of a unity. Do you see anything in American culture that could provide that same sort of backstep, where if in the event that total disorder erupts and there's truly a collapse on a global scale of the American empire, what is going to pick up the pieces?
Yes, I do think there is something to that effect, but I'd like to contextualize it first. So we said that given there is disorder and that kind of hard reset or hard breakdown, what will take its place? Well, I think given that such a thing occurs, such an event happens, a lot of the ills that plague America right now could not survive. So we said before, or at least I alluded to this, I think a lot of people aren't living under illusions. Rather, what I mean is they're living under, their view of the purpose of life is not well-founded. And they think, a lot of people, I think, view political ideology as something of extreme importance. And if a sort of collapse like that were to occur, then that illusion would be shattered pretty much instantly. And we would see that, survival would become a factor, but also the close link between group survival and morality would all of a sudden become extremely apparent again. And so there might be a reemergence of Christianity or a more weird 21st century paganism. I don't know. But I guess my point is, if such a reset were to happen, the ills keeping back authentic human culture right now in America would fade away.
So you think that a collapse is fundamentally grounds for a reemergence of things that are no longer viable? That's interesting.
Yeah. So we might say that, authentic human culture is still at work, just it's in a constant state of suffocation and being snuffed out by social media fueled politics. And if social media fueled politics were to collapse, then culture would take again its place.
So where do you see the role of Christianity in here? Obviously, you alluded to it as one possible outcome, Christianity, or perhaps I think you said an American paganism. Could Christianity really be the healing salve that could possibly restore order, even given the state that we have well diagnosed as being not well, right? I think that we were discussing earlier how the church is, especially in its hierarchy and especially here in America, undergoing a crisis of identity. Is it strong enough to emerge as something that could provide a little bit of order in a state of chaos?
Yes, it is, but only if it's strong enough on its own terms. So we said before that, if we consider everything we do and everything we think in life as a means to a political end, then I think we'll continue living in this state we're in now. However, if people view their status as, so I'm a Catholic or even just any sort of a Christian in general, as the most salient thing they do, and then politics is something they do on the side, but then there might be a political reconciliation, I don't mean that in just a bipartisan way, but a resolution to our societal, almost sociological, political fractures. And that would become, that process would accelerate and become inevitable if some kind of real social breakdown were to occur. However, if we want to recruit Christianity for political ends, that is always extremely difficult. And I'm not sure you'd actually get the political ends you want if we're talking about a real kind of collective psychological reckoning with our worst selves. However, I guess that would be the end of my answer. If we want Catholicism or Christianity just in general to work its magic, then it needs to understand itself as at the center of the human universe and at the center of just the globe and the world and the universe in general. And if it once again understands itself as the most significant possible thing a human being can be involved with beyond politics, or as in like superior to politics, then the politics may heal. But if we consider it a means to an end, then I don't think it'll work.
I think a good way to kind of maybe contextualize the whole conversation we've had and bring it in some sense to a conclusion would be to reflect on, what's to do next. Heidegger once said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that once the creators are viewed as a triviality within society, and once they are tolerated no more as something other than a curiosity, then that's when the decline has become. And he very particularly identifies the creators as being poets, thinkers, and statesmen. So the question I think here becomes, what is the individual to do if we are to save a society that is perhaps on the verge of collapse, or once it does collapse, what are we to do? It would seem that Heidegger would say that we would have something of a vocation to emerge as thinkers, poets, and statesmen. And I'm curious, what do you think that looks like here in the 21st century on the American continent?
I think the creators are still in charge. We just have terrible quality creators. So we have extremely charismatic statesmen, and they might, to some extent, some of them might be doing their job, and then others are just wildly corrupt. And we have poets. That comes in the form of the culture industry, as I would maybe describe it. I just came up with that just now. There might be a better word for that. But there is a cultural industry, the music business and the movie business. David Brooks wrote an article like a year ago now about how the Avengers movie saga has become its own kind of great awakening in America and its own kind of religious impetus for the American soul. And so it's not as though we don't have poets. We just have poets that aren't connected with being the way Heidegger maybe would have wanted them to. Certainly not the way Jung would want them to be. And further, what was the other one? Thinkers. We have the thinkers. The Academy is, in some ways, at an all-time kind of climactic high. It's just that the thinkers don't particularly care about truth. They care about serving their own thoughts. And so I guess I'm kind of challenging Heidegger's premise that it's not that these three groups need to regain their prominence. They always have their prominence. It's they need to regain their own selves.
And so what does that mean for you?
For me, it means
what calling does that give to you in your life as a data scientist for Kroger and a student at the university?
It means I need to be as genuine an executor of those duties as possible, while also subliminating them to my higher calling just as a human being, and for me, a person of God. And I don't mean that in kind of a shallow way. I mean it that it's an ongoing act of reckoning with myself. I mean that in the sense that I'm not sure what my place will be or might have been when I die, but rather if I carry out the actions that I know are proper of me, then over the course of time, those might have added up to something greater.
Fantastic. Harrison, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate your time, and I hope that the conversation was as thought-provoking and as stimulating for you as it was for me.
I had a tremendous time. Thanks for having me, Doyle.
Thank you so much. All right, this has been an episode of Cryptosophy where we're searching for hidden wisdom. Thank you so much.